Welcome in, everyone. We're back again for another episode of Stand for Kind Talks. With your hostesses, Candy Olant and Kristen Chapman.
Hello.
Our guest today is Carolyn Kirkwood. She's the owner of Kirkwood Family Therapy. She's in Buffalo, New York, and you may recognize Carolyn's face or voice depending on how you're listening or viewing us. She was with us a few weeks ago. We were talking about bullying and cyberbullying and just all the effects that can have on a young person's psyche and their mental health. And that led us into thinking about having Carolyn back on to discuss just stress in general and trauma in teens, how that presents, how we can best support them, and just tips to help us just get through day to day.
Yeah, welcome, Carolyn. Thank you so much for joining us again. We appreciate your time. Could you give our listeners just a little bit of your backstory for maybe people who didn't listen to the last podcast?
Sure. So I'm Carolyn Kirkwood. I am a social worker. I have a master's degree in social work. I am a mom and a wife, and my husband and I have 3 children. I am the owner of a private practice called Kirkwood Fam Therapy. FAM is an acronym for Family Addiction Mental Health. Those are the 3 areas of study that I work most closely with in my private practice doing psychotherapy. I also work with families, individuals, and children as well. And when I'm not seeing patients, I am an adjunct professor at one of the colleges down here in Buffalo. I teach a psychology course there. Some semesters I teach sociology. So working with mental health is something that I truly enjoy.
That is awesome. So last time we had you on, we were talking about stress, post-traumatic stress for educators, and educators are experiencing, and that kind of led us into wanting to talk a little bit about trauma, because we know that's one of your specialties too.
Yes.
So
Absolutely.
How does trauma typically present in teens?
Trauma typically presents in teens in their behavior. So a teenager's behavior is always going to be the absolute first thing that changes when they're experiencing something. And some of those behaviors could include crying, right? Because for a 4-year-old, they cry every day, all the time for no reason. But a teenager, you may not have seen cry in months or years because it's not a common behavior of theirs. So changes like that in their behavior are things that are red flags for them. Being easily irritable, and withdrawal. So if they are withdrawing from the things that they really enjoy, then you know that those are usually the red flags that something's going on with the teenager.
So does that mean they're like constantly kind of like in fight or flight if they've experienced trauma? How does that affect their body?
Yes, great question. So the fight or flight thing drains the body. So if they're constantly trying to, run away from the trauma and hide it, it's draining. You can only do that for so long, and you can only keep up with it for so long. So though that's where the withdrawal behaviors and stuff like that comes in, because now their body is exhausted. They don't have the energy to continue to go on.
When you were describing like typical trauma, I guess, symptoms or how it would present in teens.
Yeah.
It's hard because a lot of those things kind of sound like typical teenage behavior.
Yeah.
How would a parent or an educator be able to tell the difference? That's got to be really hard.
So that is really hard. And a couple of things to note is that, like, you have to know your teenager, right? Now, some behaviors, like I mentioned before, are completely abnormal, like persistent crying or extra irritable, things like that. If you know your teenager and this is normally a happy-go-lucky, bubbly teenager and they always want to be in the clubs and they stay after school for basketball and they do this and they do that, and now all of a sudden they, I just want to stay home. Can I please not go to school today? Things like that. You want to kind of look into that, because although no teenager wants to go to school ever, but completely like flat refuse to go to school every single day, all of a sudden, that's usually a change. And that usually kind of, means something's going on, something to look into that's probably going on with the teenager. And then you also want to take a look at their mood. The mood is probably the hardest one to tell because we talked about before, right? How sometimes teenagers are just moody for no explained reason besides being a teenager, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That, you just want to, sometimes when you have a relationship with a child, you do get to kind of learn their natural mannerisms. So being mindful of that and just kind of monitoring those to make sure that they're the natural mannerisms versus something changing.
Can it present like, okay, so mood for sure. What about like appetite or sleep hygiene or how they dress? Are these red flags too with trauma?
Absolutely. The eating and the sleeping for sure are usually associated with trauma. The style of dress is more loosely associated with different forms of mental health, not specifically to trauma. Okay. But that can come into play with different things of mental health, specifically depression. Will change the way your physical appearance, the way that you dress, things like that. But when it comes to trauma, your appetite and your sleeping are two of the bigger red flags for sure.
Okay.
So much that you talk about with the red flags. Candy and I have been doing a ton of research into bullying. Yeah. We have been spending the past couple of weeks really deep diving into bullying, and so many of the symptoms that you're talking about are also symptoms for children or teens that are being bullied.
Sure.
Is being bullied, can that be a source of trauma? What are different sources of trauma?
So common sources of trauma, I would say, are, you'd be surprised. So like the school shootings, right? Mm-hmm. That is sadly and, unfortunately becoming a norm, right? And I hate to even admit that because that sounds so ridiculous that a school shooting is becoming a norm. But, it's something that unfortunately has been happening more often. So for a child, something like that, to hear that on the news and to constantly see it on social media, you're going to be traumatized by that. You're never going to want to go to school again because school historically has been your safe place, And so like when I was coming up in school was always the safe place. So kids that didn't have food at home and didn't have consistent parents at home and didn't have friends at home, they had all those things at school. Your school was your safe place. And now with all the violence and the scary things that goes on in school, and the bullying and all that stuff that happens at school, it's no longer considered the safe place. Also, another thing I want to add to that is the entire BLM movement. So the entire Black Lives Matter movement is also really triggering and traumatic for kids because it's also something that's like in your face, It's all over social media. It's all over the news, all over TV. Everybody's talking about it everywhere you go. And it's really traumatic for a child to constantly have to hear about the different things that goes on in that area. And then the other one that's really common for teens is sexual abuse. So sexual abuse is more common than you think. And a lot of children have experienced some sort of sexual abuse in their lifetime. And it's a really difficult and embarrassing thing to talk about. So children internalize those things. And I see that a lot in my practice where with adults and with children, where they are just, always trying to protect at least somebody and they're damaging themselves while they're keeping in that stuff. So for instance, if let's say a stepdad has abused a child, the child wants to protect mom, right? And they don't want mom to know that her boyfriend or that her husband or whatever did this, so they won't say anything. So the child is then suffering. Things like that. So it's all of those things. Those are just a few examples of what, common sources of trauma are for teens.
I am telling you, just nailed it. Okay, so I'll share a quick story since this is, we're back and forth. So I was 17 and no, maybe I might have been 16, 17, somewhere around there. And I picked up a part-time job and I won't say where, but my best friend's mother's boyfriend owned the business.
Okay.
And when I went to work for there, he would not leave me alone. Like he was constantly making, comments and being inappropriate. And I was like, is it something, at first I was like, is it something I'm doing? I felt shame and I felt guilt, and I was like, is this my fault? Am I dressing in a way that is inviting this? Of course, it was always our fault especially in my generation or whatever. And one day I remember we went to grab something to eat for the rest of the people in the group, and he, took me to like this offsite location and was like saying inappropriate things. I was like, no, we're not, you're gonna have to take me back. I'm done. Well, I will tell you, trying to tell my best friend's mother that her boyfriend had done this and was behaving this way, I was traumatized. So I understand how hard it can be to find your voice, to say something, to get help, to whatever, it's really hard. And if you don't have a support system at home, or a trusted adult that you can talk to, it's even more difficult, and that trauma can just fester.
Yep, absolutely.
And that support system is so key too, because typically people who are causing this trauma tend to isolate. I mean, when you said that he took you to a different place, like that nailed it. That's isolation. He's trying to get you alone, and it can cut off your support systems.
That's so true. And, I was a lot more fortunate than a lot of people where it didn't escalate. But I do understand, where you're coming from with that. I think it's hard for some of the kids to, like I said, find their voice to be able to say something because they feel that guilt and shame like it's their fault.
Sure.
Yeah, I think that's another thing too, is victims placing blame on themselves. Is that typical, Carolyn? Do you see that a lot?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Because when something bad happens, and it's a normal thing to try to make it make sense, right? So everybody wants to understand why this bad thing happened to me, how this happened to me. And when I teach about the stages of grief, there's one stage called bargaining, to where you're always trying to figure out, like, what if, well, maybe if, and if, and if. And the key word in the bargaining stage that I always say is the word if, because you're trying to figure out a why. So you're trying to make it make sense. You're trying to give it some context, right? So you're trying to either find a blame or you have to figure out some sort of reason, because when you're going through something, it's really difficult for a victim or a survivor, I like to call them, to just accept that bad things happen. It's easier to deal with the feelings when you can find a reason for it. So that's why that, is a really common thing for a survivor.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
A reason. So when you're talking about, we were talking about teens and how that trauma presents, so for like, an adolescent, a younger kiddo, maybe an elementary school teacher is listening to this, or a parent of a younger child, does trauma present differently in them, or is it pretty much the same across the board?
It's pretty standard across the board, considering age appropriateness, if you will. But so, like, for instance, for a younger child, maybe an adolescent child, bedwetting is a common symptom of trauma. Versus where an adult, probably not bedwetting, but withdrawal and isolation is more common for a child that age. Or for an adult, or a teenager. Yeah.
Again, lived that one with my son. When this tsunami thing happened back years ago, he was at his grandparents' house, and it was on, and they didn't filter that. And so he watched all those newsreels over and over again of the tsunami hitting. And he was traumatized by it. And it took a long time for us to realize what was happening, why the bedwetting, that kind of situation, why is this happening? And we finally were able to put it together through questioning and, all that kind of stuff. So that's very interesting. Poor kids.
Candy, did you all figure out, like, what caused that trauma in your son? Like, did you figure that out quickly?
No,
or
it took a while.
I was just thinking, like, what if you don't know that your child's been in a traumatic situation? Because there are events like school shootings and stuff that that your child has been a part of. But then there's stuff like that where parents may
Yeah, we
just
just
not
never
know.
dreamed, you know,
Mhm.
we just never dreamed that they wouldn't monitor what he was watching, or, you know, he was in the room or whatever, because he was maybe 7 or 8 when that
Mhm.
happened. Um, it took a lot of like, okay, what's going on at school? I was talking to his school counselor. I was talking to his teachers.
Yeah.
His dad and I were just every which way evaluating anybody he came into contact with. And it came up in conversation, I think, one day when we realized that that was what the trigger had been.
Mhm.
But it was a lot of waking up, not a lot of nights went by before we realized what the trigger was. And then once we were able to talk about it, he could put words to it. It stopped as fast as it started.
Wow.
Wow. So, Carolyn, what do you recommend that a parent does if they think that they're seeing some of these signs and symptoms that you're talking about? What do they do? Like, what's the first step?
The absolute first step is to reach out to a professional. I don't always recommend you try to beat it out of the child to get them to tell you what's going on, because that often, if they do it naturally, great, that's amazing. But trying to like really keep pushing at it to get the child to tell you, that makes the therapeutic relationship a little bit harder than for, when you get them professional help, because they have to relive it again and then tell the professional what's going on. When telling mom, it just really brings awareness to it, but you can't really intervene because that's the therapist's job, right? And so now they have to relive it and tell the therapist again, or now the therapist got to really work for it because the child is just really in a bad place and not wanting to relive that. So allowing the child the space to do that one time with a professional so that they can also immediately intervene. Because as parents, all we're going to do is call a therapist or call a school, call a social worker and get help, right? And so as a therapist, the best way that we treat is using CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy, and DBT. Those are my biggest go-tos, especially working with children and teens, just helping them to, DBT is more of like mindfulness and getting them to learn how to stay in the moment, because sometimes with children, with the bedwetting and stuff like that, they have dreams and images, like intrusive thoughts that really stay with them. So just kind of working through those things and developing coping skills for the child. And those are things that you really got to do with a therapist. So I just encourage a parent to, when you know that something's going on or when you suspect that something's going on, you can ask and see how it goes, but not push, and then just immediately get yourself in contact with your pediatrician or a therapist or whatever you feel that you have at your fingertips to get the child the support that they need.
I've seen the benefits of DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy. I've seen the benefits of that. A company I previously worked with a group here in Knoxville that did it in a group setting, and it's pretty intensive, and it was life-changing for several of those people, where they were able to function in group settings where they hadn't been able to do that before. They were forming more meaningful relationships, and it really helped them on a day-to-day basis have like a toolbox that they could pull from when they started to feel and recognize certain things going on. They knew how to counteract that. So if someone doesn't have access to those types of therapies as an adolescent, as a teen, what's that look like for them as they get older if it's not addressed?
Sure. So there are tons of long-term effects that comes with dealing with trauma. I would say the 5 most common are depression, anger, anxiety, eating disorders, and substance use or substance abuse. So depression comes in different forms, and anger is one of the most common ones that I'm seeing across different age groups, different populations, because when something has happened to you and you feel wrong, you naturally develop anger. And sometimes that anger is, long lasting. It can last for many years, anger and resentment and frustration because something negative has happened to you. That's, one of the really common things. Substance abuse is common because that one is how people mask the feelings, right? So when you're feeling less well and you want to feel better, you need something to numb the pain or to numb the feelings. So a lot of people turn to substance abuse so that they can alter their state of mind and no longer be in the present moment and feel the current feelings that they're using. And then we talked about eating disorders. Different eating disorders are prominent. There's not one specific one because it shows up in different people. It manifests itself in different ways depending on the person. Some people engage in compulsive eating. Some people engage in purging. So it just kind of really depends on, you know, the coping mechanism or the maladaptive behavior that you tend to choose. Yeah.
So we've heard that, and correct me if this is wrong, because we can debunk the myth, that's like the substance abuse is like self-medicating, right?
Yes, correct.
Okay, so self-medicating in an unhealthy way, not good. And then the eating disorders, I've been told, is trying to regain some sort of control over oneself.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. Yes, that's exactly what it is. You can control what goes in and you can control how it comes back out. So it's just like, you know how like for sexual abuse, for example, most traumas, but like sexual abuse is just one example where someone has taken advantage of you and they were stronger than you, more powerful than you, and you didn't have control, right? So just in order to make yourself feel better and to feel like you're regaining control over your own body and your own self, that's just something that you have at your fingertips that you can control. So yes, that's absolutely it. Yes.
So Candy and I have actually done a whole podcast on self-regulation and coping skills. How does trauma affect your ability to self-regulate?
So depending on the trauma, certain skills may work for one person and not for another, right? So for example, if I use journaling a lot, and I offer that to a lot of my clients and say, okay, writing out your feelings and kind of, or writing a letter to the person that has wronged you, things like that, just getting those feelings off your chest, right? But depending on the trauma, a person that was kind of lured in by letters, I wouldn't have that person write, if that makes sense. So you know how like if you're trying, like if an abuser is trying to get a child or get a teenager, they're going to write little cute love letters and put stickers on it and just trying to use that, you know, to try to get you in before they abuse you. So something like that, I wouldn't recommend that person did journaling. But another person that has a ton of feelings bottled up, I might say, okay, you need to get those feelings out. And we do different things. Like one of my go-tos is writing a letter to the person that wronged you. And what I do is I have them write the letter. And if it's like an in-person session, we'll do different things. Like we'll tie it to a helium balloon and let it go. I've even done that for grief. So I've done that if, you know, how some person passes away and you've never got a chance to say this, or you wanted them to know that, or whatever. And you're kind of holding on to those feelings. You have feelings of guilt or whatever it is. Just kind of writing those feelings down. We tie it to a helium balloon. We go outside and we let it go. Or when I do that mostly with younger adults, and children. With adults, we would even write out all of those feelings, write out a letter to your abuser and to whoever you feel like has wronged you. We take it outside and we burn it. So now you were able to get those feelings out, and the gesture of either burning it or letting it go just kind of is like your release, right? So now you're making a conscious choice and an effort to release those feelings so that you can move on and finding forgiveness. So those are just like a couple of things that I like to do. So depending on the trauma, you know, we just kind of adjust it.
Yeah. It makes me think in the classroom, there were a couple of times where, you know, it was just a cohort that had experienced a lot of trauma, you know, parent deaths, parent suicides, you know, different things like that. And so part of our, you know, community or classroom meetings, we would write things down that were bothering us, that were very private. We put up our privacy screens or whatever. And then they would write it out. They would think about it for a minute. We'd crumble it up, right? And we would throw it in the trash.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked through like what that symbolized, being able to let it go and things like that. And then one time we had a snowball fight in the gym where they did that. They had a big wad of paper. They had written all the things that were bothering them. And then we went into and we broke up into groups and we had a big snowball fight. And then we picked them all up and threw them in the trash and we went on about our day. But it's amazing. And those were fourth graders. Like you could see.
Yeah. I did a similar exercise when I taught first grade. We did paper airplanes. So same thing. We wrote out whatever it is that you wanted to write out. We made the paper airplanes and then we flew them around the class. And so the kids were able to like, you know, get some energy off, blow off some steam and deal with their feelings all at the same time. And you'd be surprised how those small gestures really help children.
Yeah. Where are we? Let's see here.
Carolyn, you've brought up grief a couple different times in this podcast. Can you talk about the difference between trauma and grief, the similarities, differences?
Thank you. Yes. So grief is the loss of something or someone. So the reason why it's the loss of something or someone, because you can grieve a thing. So a lot of people only associate grief with death, and that's not quite what grief is completely about. So sure, you do grieve a death, but you can grieve a thing. So what is a thing that you could grieve? So like if your house burned down to the ground, that's your childhood home. Everything you own is in there. All of your toys, your shoes, your memories, your clothes, your laptop, absolutely everything.
Pictures.
You're going to grieve all of that stuff. You're going to grieve the home. You're going to grieve the memories. You're going to grieve the toys, the laptop, the bed, everything about it. You're going to miss those things, right? And you're going to go through that same feeling of loss and displacement that you do when you lose a loved one or a friend. So that's why grief is intense feelings of sorrow after the loss of something or someone. And in comparison to trauma is the aftermath after experiencing something egregious. So after you experience something egregious, it's the feelings and the behaviors associated with that and trying to deal with those feelings after, you know, that strong event that you've experienced. So that's the difference between grief and trauma.
So you gave the example of like your house burning down and you losing everything. You're obviously, anyone would go through like a big period of grief after that.
Sure.
Can that also cause trauma?
Absolutely. So the trauma in that is just kind of, most of the time a person feels the trauma if they were like there, they saw it, they experienced it, they heard it. And if you're not like directly impacted by the physical burning down, it's usually then grief. You're just grieving the aftermath of what happened, the loss of everything that you lost. But trauma is like, so if you were there at that fire and somebody had to rescue you and you saw flames and you smelled smoke, those memories are going to be lasting. So you're going to constantly see flames and hear that smoke detector going off and all those things associated with the actual trauma. That stuff you'll carry with you for a long time, not just the loss. But let's just say you're not there and you just experienced the loss, you're not carrying that trauma of the actual event itself. It's more of the loss, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I was just curious.
Yeah, it does. I think that was a great question for sure. It makes me, okay, so I was thinking about the next thing I wanted to ask you about. So, you know, you're on the airplane and they're like, okay, you know, going through their spiel, the flight attendants, and they're like, okay, put your mask on first, you know, before you put it on the person next to you.
Yep.
So thinking from a caregiver, a parent's perspective, that parent or caregiver has experienced trauma, loss, grief, all the above in their life. And it's unresolved. And now they're trying to parent a tiny human. Because we're proponents of mental health, mental fitness, doing all the things to be better with who we are. What advice would you give a parent or caregiver who's carrying a pretty heavy load and they're also trying to be a parent?
Yep. So the thing that I always tell parents is that you have to be well yourself in order to take care of another person. So if you being well yourself means you getting yourself into therapy first, you connecting with your higher power, you starting to journal, whatever it is that you feel that you need to do to get yourself well should take priority. And it's very similar to that example that you said on the airlines. You have to take care of yourself first, because if you're less well, you can't help another person. You can't help a child. You can't help a loved one, anything like that, when you're not in a safe space yourself. So just kind of really that self-care and that putting yourself first, and as parents, that's one thing that we all struggle with. Well, I know that I struggle with as a parent. It's just kind of making sure that Carolyn has what Carolyn needs before the kids get dinner, the kids get dance, the kids go to swim, and the kids this, and the husband needs that, and all that stuff. Making sure that you took your medication today and that you gave yourself breakfast today and that you have the energy, because you can't even drive them to school if you're tired or if you're, not well. So just making sure that you put yourself first, even though you're a parent and you have to take care of the kids. And that's really hard as parents to do. It's very
hard. Kristen and I have talked about mom guilt, and there's dad guilt for single dads or same-sex partners, whatever. Everybody's included. But what advice do you have for those individuals who legitimately feel guilty about taking an hour and a half or 2 hours out of their week to go focus on their mental health?
Yeah. So my advice to that is that we have to be the change. And I invite you and encourage you to also help us to change that stigma and to break that change. So if you aren't feeling well, you got a stomach ache, you got a migraine, and you need to leave work, you're probably going to do it unapologetically, right? Because you get sick days, and sick days are just normal. So if you got an appointment or if you're at work and you're not feeling well, you'll leave. And
girl, unless you're a teacher, we all know how that goes.
It's true.
Yeah, that can be tough. And you have to be open to and willing to also put your mental health in that same priority category. And I feel like, as a community, we also have to normalize that. And I think that organizations should start moving into allowing mental health days the same way we do sick days, or the same day we do vacation days, PTO days, all that stuff, just to focus on your mental wellness. And I think the more as a society we normalize it, then as people we'll be more open to doing it. Because calling in sick is a normal thing, people are more likely to do it if they really needed to. But having a mental health day isn't the most common and normal thing. So now we're a little bit more reluctant to do it. So I just encourage and invite all parents to help me be that change. Go ahead and, step out there and be that change and go do it. It's necessary.
It's good advice.
It is.
Really
I agree.
is.
So, Carolyn, what is your number one piece of advice to parents of teenagers?
Okay, so my number one piece of advice for parents to teenagers is to build trust. Building some trust with your teenager is really going to get you a long way. So building trust is sometimes harder to do. So like if a child confides in you and tells you that they did something wrong, right? If you can just accept that wrong thing and in turn say, oh my gosh, you know what? Thank you for telling me that. You didn't have to do that. I'm really proud of you. You're not grounded, but we got to figure this out. Like we got to make sure that this doesn't happen again. Then that teenager is then going to trust you and they're going to want to tell you the next time something happens. So you just want to, kind of pick your battles, and everything that they do, doesn't have to be a punishment. You should embrace that, embrace the idea that they opened up to you and that they talked to you so that you can build that trust.
I would much rather my teenager get advice from me who has worldly experience, right, than a peer.
That's right. Because if you think about it, the number one reason why children lie is because what? They don't want to get in trouble. That's the number one reason why they lie. So if they feel like they can tell you certain things without getting in trouble, they're going to be more open to doing it, and they're going to be more comfortable doing it.
What's a quick self-regulation technique that a teen could practice or use?
Okay, so there's all different types of apps out there for self-help and like meditation, affirmations. The affirmations are huge. And I think that as teenagers really need to be affirmed every day, told that they are good people, told that they're beautiful. Giving positive affirmations is something that a teenager really, really needs. So downloading some of those apps so that they can automatically get an alert to their phone every day. And then as parents, as the adults, as the teachers, the mentors, the parents, we need to affirm these children more. We need to congratulate them and pat them on the back for everything that they do, just so that they can continue to build the confidence in themselves as young people.
What if your child won't talk to you about a traumatic event?
So that's a great question. So I was just talking about that before. If a child won't talk to you, it's really not best practice to push them. Your best bet is to then connect them with a professional. And you much rather connect them with a professional and find out it was nothing than to not connect them and find out later that it was something. So my best advice to a parent is that if and when a child won't open up to you, it's actually sometimes better that they don't if they're not comfortable, so that they don't have to do that more than once. So them opening up to a professional is going to be best anyhow. And then, we can do our best to loop you in when the child feels comfortable and all that stuff. But, linking them to a professional. So reaching out to the school social worker, to the pediatrician, or whatever it is that you have at your fingertips, connecting them with a professional.
Difference between depression and grief?
Yes. So the difference between depression and grief. So grief, as we talked about, is an intense feeling of sorrow after the loss of something or someone. Depression are symptoms of withdrawal and different physical aspects after experiencing something. And sometimes a person can experience depression just because without a rhyme or reason. And a lot of people expect, well, if I say I'm depressed, well, why? What happened? And it's not like that. Depression comes from a chemical imbalance in the brain. So that chemical imbalance can occur just because, or it can occur in response to something. So those are kind of the differences between depression and grief.
Carolyn Kirkwood, thank you so much for joining us today on Stand for Kind Talks. We really appreciate you and just all of your wonderful insights. So appreciate your time.
Of course. Thank you guys so much for having me.
Thank you, Carolyn. Maybe we'll see you again next time.
Absolutely.